You're sitting in the back room of the house, just past midnight. The fire's low, but the air still feels heavy. You're not asleep, not fully awake, just listening. And then you hear it, a creak, long and low, not from the floorboards, not from the porch, from somewhere else you can't identify. The kind of sound old timber makes under weight. The kind of sound that doesn't reveal where it's coming from. You check the hallway, nothing. You check the doors, locked. You tell yourself it's the house settling, but it doesn't feel like that. In Appalachian tradition, they call it the coffin sound, a warning, a sign that death is moving, not just nearby, but close enough to be choosing who's next. Some folks say it's the coffin calling to be filled. Others say it's the soul rehearsing its exit. Either way, once you hear it, you don't ask what it was. You ask who it's for. In these stories, death doesn't arrive unannounced. It gives you the knock, 3 taps at the door. It pauses the clock. It mutes the fire. It clouds the mirror in the hallway when nobody's breathing on the glass. Sometimes it comes from the smell of soil. Wet, fresh turned dirt, sharp in the air where no dirt belongs. You smell it in the hallway or near the kitchen. No reason, no source. Sometimes a candle burns blue, flickers once and goes out. That's not just a draft. That's death taking a breath. And when it's really close, it doesn't shout. It quiets everything around it. Makes the dog restless. Makes the fire lean low. Makes the room feel like it's holding its breath. And that's how you know. I'm Papa G, and this is the Feral Folklorist, and today we're heading into Appalachian death lore, the signs that show up before the body goes cold, the knocks, the creaks, the sounds nobody admits they heard until it's too late. In the mountains, when someone was dying, it was felt in the air and in the silence. You watched the house. You paid attention. The signs were there. They always were. You just had to know what to look for. It might start with the dog. Wouldn't go into that room. Wouldn't eat. Just stared at the door like it knew something was coming. The fire might not burn right. The logs were dry, but the flame kept dropping low. The air would feel heavy in places, not cold exactly, just wrong. One of the most common signs was the knock, though. Always 3, not loud, just enough to hear, sometimes on the door, sometimes inside a wall, sometimes at the headboard of the bed. It didn't matter where it came from. What mattered was that it came. Folks would say, "I heard the knock last night," and whoever was listening would know to check on their people. These stories didn't always come from people who believed in ghosts. Most of the time, they came from folks who just seen too much not to believe in these patterns. If the same thing happened before 3 different deaths, you started to pay attention. You didn't have to call it magic. You just called it familiar. But it wasn't just knocking. Some folks heard fluttering instead, wings that were soft but heavy, circling the eaves at night. Not the chatter of the chimney swifts or a barn owl's cry, just that steady whoomph, whoomph sound like something's too large to land. They called it the death bird. If it circled 3 times and never called out, The message was clear. Someone in the house was already marked. There were other signs, too. A picture falling off the wall, especially if it was a photo of someone still living. Didn't matter if it cracked or not, if it dropped without reason, someone would be gone by sundown. You could try to tape it back up, but folks say that it just made the spirit restless. There's a long-standing tradition of stopping clocks when someone dies, not just to mark the time, but to give the house room to shift. You stop the clock to pause everything, to separate life from death in a clean line. Now, in some houses, they'd stop the clock the moment someone passed and wouldn't start them again until after the funeral. Not because they were waiting on grief to lift, but because they were waiting on the dead to leave fully. Also, during this time, people would stop a clock for more practical reasons. It would show the time of death, so when the doctor arrived, he could record it. And then there were the clocks that stopped early, or worse, ran backwards. Just for a minute, just long enough for someone to see it and say nothing. That clock ran backwards on Tuesday, an uncle might say, lighting a cigarette. Didn't mention it because I didn't want to call it down. Mirrors were covered for similar reasons. A mirror in a death room wasn't just a surface, it was a risk. If a spirit caught its reflection before it moved on, it might stay. Or worse, it might get confused and stick around without meaning to. So you covered the glass. Didn't matter with what. It could be a towel, a blanket, a piece of clothing. No matter what was close, as long as it was covered. Nobody asked questions, they just did it. In some families, all the reflective surfaces got covered, not just mirrors. It could be glass photo frames, shiny stovetop lids, anything that might catch a face. And it wasn't for show. It wasn't to create a mood. It was to keep the path clear. Then we have the sounds. People called it the coffin being built. You'd hear hammering in the back of the house, or the slow groan of wood settling, even if nobody was walking. Some said it sounded like a box being slid across the attic floor. No footsteps, just the box, and then silence. It wasn't just one family saying this. You can find versions of that story all over Appalachia, western North Carolina, eastern Kentucky, the foothills of Virginia. Different counties, different generations, but the same sound. In houses where someone had been a carpenter, the sound was even more specific. They'd say it sounded like nails being tapped in, not driven hard, just that soft, steady setting of a lid. And not every sign was a sound. Sometimes it was stillness. In mountain culture, the stillness before death isn't empty, it's charged. The room goes quiet in a way that feels watched. The fire flickers with this different rhythm and people talk lower. Even children hush without being told. That's when you know the house has started to shift. When you feel the weight of something that isn't quite here yet, but isn't gone either. You'd see people start moving through the house with a different kind of pace. They'd check the window latches and they'd sweep the porch steps. They'd tuck the blanket around the dying person and pull the shade in that room, but they'd leave the other ones open. All of this was intentional. Some homes kept a chair turned slightly away from the deathbed, not for a visitor, not for comfort, but for the spirit, so it wouldn't sit in the bed too long, so it wouldn't get stuck there. People would also salt the doors, not to block death, but to keep it from dragging something else back in with it. You didn't stop death. You made sure it passed through cleanly. In parts of eastern Tennessee, there's also a practice of opening a window right after someone passes. Just one, enough to give the spirit a place to leave. And you don't close it again until the candle burns all the way down or the room feels still again. Even if you didn't believe in spirits, you probably still did these things because someone in the family did them before you. And that's how it gets passed on, quietly, without explanation. Some of the signs people wouldn't even mention until after they happened. They would say something like, the clock struck the day before, or the mirror in the hallway cracked on its own. Not because they forgot, because they didn't want to speak it too soon. There's also the stories people carry around with them, but they don't share with someone else unless they're asked first. They might smell pipe tobacco in the back room after the body's gone. Or there might be a cold patch at the foot of the bed days later. Or a dream where someone knocks but doesn't say a word. These aren't ghost stories. They're household memories, and they carry weight. So most of what people call death signs in the mountains aren't framed as spells. You won't find folks calling it a ritual. But the way they handle it, the timing, the steps, and the repetition makes it clear it's magic, just not the kind that needs to announce itself. Stopping a clock at the moment of death isn't just a custom, it's a spiritual containment. In folk logic, time is more than a number, it's a current. If it keeps moving after someone dies, there's a risk the spirit might not realize they're supposed to leave. So stopping the clock is like marking a door. The moment the body let go, the house did too. There are stories about families that leave the clock stopped for exactly 3 days, and some won't restart them until after the last visitor has left. It's not out of superstition, but because those days belong to the dead. That's when the boundary is sort of soft, they would say. The house holds this different kind of weight, so you don't rush it. And the mirrors get the same treatment, not because people are scared of what they'll see, but because they know the spirit might still be watching. So in Appalachian folk belief, and in hoodoo too, a mirror is a portal, not always open, but always capable. If you leave it uncovered and a soul might glimpse itself on the way out, this can confuse things. They might get stuck. They might choose to stay. They might look back at their life and decide, I don't want to go. And it might get them circling the house instead of heading on. So the glass gets covered, not to shut them out, but just to keep them moving. Some people wrap the mirrors in black cloths. Others, like we said, just throw a dish towel over it. It doesn't need to be fancy. It's the action that matters the most. So in households with this strong tradition of working signs, even photos with glass are covered, especially portraits. That's because the dead can attach themselves to likenesses, especially when they're grieving or confused. You don't give them a place to stay unless you mean for them to visit. And then we move on to the knock. 3 soft knocks that come with no clear source. You don't open the door. You don't look for it. You just recognize it. That's the signal. Not from the person dying, but from what's on its way. It might come days before. It might come the morning of, but it still comes. Now, in root work and folk magic, the number 3 holds power. It's a way of setting something in motion or sealing it. When death sends 3 knocks, it's not just saying someone will pass. It's letting you know that the work has begun, that it's time to get your house in order. Now, some folks will light a candle right then and there, and that's what we referenced before about you don't do anything until the candle burns all the way down or the room feels still again. This comes from the tradition of lighting the candle. And others will salt the thresholds or sweep the porch. And some will set a chair by the door and say, you're not invited in, but you're seen. So it's not about summoning. It's about this structure of a ritual. But that's all it is, really. It's structure. So the magic here isn't about control. It's about this clarity of what is happening. The sound of hammering in the house, what people call that coffin noise, it's symbolic. In folk magic, sound is movement. If you hear a creak in the same place, same rhythm, and there's no one causing it, that's something shifting into the space. That spirit energy preparing for the crossing. Some people say it sounds like a lid being shut, and others say it's like something being nailed in. Either way, once it starts, you act. You don't try to stop it. You make the space ready. Open a window in the room, burn a little cedar, whisper something if you need to, say a prayer if you need to. Just keep things calm. That's the point, and that's the magic. So folk death work in the South isn't about ritual robes or these elaborate chants. It's about being ready. You've got a white candle on the windowsill. You've got the mirrors ready to be covered, and you've got a little salt in the corner of the porch. These aren't accidents. They're part of the system. They're the reasons why in a house with these practices, the dead leave cleaner and the living carry less of them with them afterwards. Now, there's a house just off a back road in western North Carolina. The family that lived there kept it for 4 generations, and they never taught much about ghosts. They didn't call it superstitious, but every time someone in the family was close to dying, the same thing happened. 3 knocks. Always on the wall between the parlor and the hallway. Always after midnight, and always followed by a stillness. It's this kind of still nothing that settles over the place like a fog. Nobody would answer the knocks. Nobody needed to. They just got up the next morning, called whoever needed to be called, and waited. And nobody ever died in that hallway, but the knocks came from nowhere else. They came from that hall. Now, in parts of eastern Kentucky, folks used to say that if a fire went out suddenly, like the logs were still good, but the flame had just collapsed, it meant someone was being prepared. Not haunted, just made ready. That's the phrase they use, made ready. One woman told a story about her uncle's place up in Letcher County. She said the dog started howling at a wall one night. Now, he didn't howl at the door. It was a wall. And then the next morning, her cousin's youngest died of pneumonia in another town. Now, there's no connection except that the uncle had been carving a toy for that child the day before. He left it half finished on the porch, and no one ever touched it again. And no one asked why. It's just sometimes these stories come from folks who don't believe in magic at all. People who tell you straight face that the knock was just plumbing, that the creak was the wind, or the smell of tobacco in the bedroom was probably a draft. But then they'll pause, look off, and say, still, it was a strange timing. That's how you know the sign landed, even if they didn't name it. The thing is, these signs don't always show up when death is going to happen. Sometimes they land nearby. A neighbor might get the knock, or a fire in the next house burns low. So the signs don't always follow property lines. They follow connection. That's why people would often call other people to let them know that they were hearing these things or seeing these things, because maybe it wasn't for your house. Maybe it was for theirs. You might hear it before a friend passes or a cousin you haven't spoken to in years, and it doesn't always come with clarity, just a feeling that something's changing, and you better keep your eyes open and be ready for whatever comes. So these aren't ghost stories in the entertainment sense. They don't come with closure, and they don't always wrap up neatly. They just get passed around from one family member to the next, from one holler to another. People know what to do when they feel that stillness in the air. And if you've ever been in a room where the air changed before the phone rang, or you watched a mirror fogged up when it wasn't near any heat source or a stove or a shower, you already know how these stories start. They start quietly. They start small. They don't ask you to believe in them. They just ask you to notice. All right, we have reached the spells segment of our show. And there's no spell that keeps death away for good. That's not what this sort of work is for. What you can do is give it a path, and a very clean one, so it doesn't get stuck. So it doesn't take more than it came for, is what you're trying to do. That's what all this is. It's boundary work. It's preparation. It's not really control, and it's not denial. So let's walk through two traditional workings. One is when death is close and the space needs to be steadied. And one is for when the room just won't settle after the passing, when something still feels off and heavy and unfinished. So we're going to call this spell When Death is Close, and its purpose is to prepare a space for a passing. It's to help the spirit move cleanly and to protect the living that stay behind from any spiritual residue. And what you'll need is one white candle or a beeswax candle, a clean bowl of water, salt, and you just use table salt, a cloth or a towel for the mirrors, and a short length of black thread. And what you do is you quiet the house, turn off all distractions, and let it settle. You cover the mirrors in any room where the dying person rests and in common spaces. Say nothing while you're doing it, just do it. You place the bowl of water near the bed or in a room where the spirit would pass through. It helps draw off static energy. Spirits are drawn to water, and this gives them a focal point that isn't a person. Then you're going to light the candle, let it burn steady, somewhere safe and visible so you can watch it. Then you take the black thread and tie 3 knots while the candle is burning. One is for the breath, one for boundary, and one for leaving. You lay the knotted thread near the door or at the bedside and don't untie it. You then sprinkle the salt at the threshold and at any back exits. Just a pinch, not to block death, but to mark the edges. And then after they pass, you snuff the candle out. Don't blow it out, snuff it out. You bury the knotted thread at the edge of the property or under a tree, and you pour the water out at possibly a crossroads or a running stream if you have one nearby. So this doesn't work to stop death. It helps the spirit find its way without confusion. And it also keeps the weight of the moment from spreading out too far. It keeps it where your grief doesn't go on for longer than it should. So now we're going to do a spell, and we're going to call it Clearing After the Death. And the purpose is to remove any lingering energy and restore the space for the living. And for this one, you're going to need a bowl of vinegar water, a clean cloth, some rosemary or pine needles. It can be dried or fresh. A small piece of iron. It could be like a nail or a key or a knife, just as long as it's iron. And what you do is you boil the herbs briefly, then let the steam rise in the room. If you can't boil them, you can burn them safely and walk the smoke through the house. You use the vinegar to wipe down surfaces. It could be door frames and windowsills, table corners, and don't forget to open a window while you do it. Then you place the iron object in a bowl of water and leave it overnight in the room where the person passed. This will ground any remaining energy and it'll hold it. And then the next morning, you pour that water off the property. It could be at a crossroads, maybe a graveyard edge, or under a really strong tree, one that's old and has really deep roots. Let the windows stay open just a little bit longer and let the house breathe. This work resets the balance. If you don't do it, you still may be fine, but you might notice the air doesn't move right. You might find the dog won't lie in their old spot, or you might dream of things that don't even belong to you and aren't even about you. This gives the house permission to go back to the living. I'm Papa G, and you have been listening to the Feral Folklorist. Now, next time we're talking about sharp magic, ritual knives, iron nails, and the edge between blessing and banishment. Because not every working is soft. Some of them cut, and we'll talk about why. So until then, If someone knocks from inside the wall, don't answer. Just light the candle. If you'd like to hear the After the Show episode where I go deeper into the folklore, spill a little extra dirt, and sometimes rant just a bit, consider becoming a patron over on my Patreon at patreon.com/PapaG. You can find the official site for the podcast at feralfolklorist.com. And if you need spell supplies for any of the workings we talk about on the show, our metaphysical shop, Aromages Botanica, has been weaving magic for over 25 years. That's over at aromages.com. And finally, don't forget about our digital magazine, Folklorium, for articles, herbal profiles, spells, and a little bit of folkloric fiction at folklorium.com.